Woman rejects millionaire, then learns he's the father of her adopted child. The ballroom sparkled under the chandelier's golden glow, every surface polished to perfection, as if the room itself was trying to dazzle the guests. Emily stood at the center of it all, her pink suit crisp, her makeup flawless, holding a bouquet of pastel-colored roses and lilies. Yet, her expression was anything but sweet. Across from her, Edward's white tuxedo made him stand out in the sea of gowns and tuxes, but it was the look on his face that drew attention, confusion and disbelief. "I said no," Emily repeated, her voice low but firm. She extended the bouquet toward him as if it were a weapon. Edward blinked, momentarily stunned, before his brow furrowed. "Emily, you don't understand what you're turning down. I'm offering you an opportunity most people would kill for." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "That's the problem, Edward. You think everything is about money. I don't want your opportunity. I don't need anything from you." The guests around them exchanged glances, murmurs buzzing through the room like an undercurrent. A wealthy businessman, publicly rejected by a woman who had no apparent wealth or status. It was a scene that could have easily been a tabloid headline. Edward's jaw tightened. "You're being unreasonable." "No," Emily countered, her voice gaining strength. "I'm being principled. You can't buy everything, Edward. And I refuse to be part of whatever game you're playing." With that, she set the bouquet down on a nearby table and turned away, leaving Edward standing alone. The crowd parted for her, their whispers growing louder as she disappeared into the shadows of the grand hallway. Hours later, Emily walked into her modest apartment, the sound of her heels clicking against the wooden floor. She sighed, kicking off her shoes, and leaned against the door for a moment before looking across the living room. The space was small but cozy, filled with second-hand furniture and mismatched decorations that somehow came together perfectly. In the corner, a little girl with curly brown hair sat cross-legged on a faded rug, coloring in a sketchbook. "Mia," Emily said softly, her tone completely different from the one she'd used with Edward. Warmth replaced steel, and her eyes softened as she crossed the room. The girl looked up, her wide eyes lighting up. "Mommy, you're home." She scrambled to her feet and ran into Emily's arms. Emily knelt, wrapping her arms around Mia and holding her tightly. "How's my favorite artist?" she asked, pulling back to look at the colorful smudges on Mia's hands and face. "I made you something," Mia said excitedly, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the coffee table. On it was a piece of paper covered in crayon drawings. A house, a sun, and two stick figures holding hands. Emily smiled, her heart swelling. "Is this us?" she asked, pointing at the figures. Mia nodded vigorously. "That's you, and that's me. And that's our house. Do you like it?" "I love it," Emily said, brushing a strand of hair from Mia's face. "You're so talented." Mia beamed, but then her expression turned thoughtful. "Mommy, why don't I have a daddy in the picture?" Emily's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Well," she said carefully, "not every family has a daddy. But that doesn't make us any less of a family, does it?" Mia shook her head slowly. "Oh, but do I have a daddy somewhere? Like, a real one?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it had any right to be. Emily swallowed, her mind racing for an answer that wouldn't break Mia's heart. "You do," she said finally, her voice steady. "But sometimes daddies aren't ready to be in their kids' lives. That doesn't mean they don't care." Mia tilted her head. "Do you think my daddy cares?" Emily's throat tightened. She didn't know the answer to that question, and the truth was, she'd never wanted to find out. "I think," she said slowly, "that anyone would care about you if they got to know you. You're the best little girl in the whole world." Mia grinned, seemingly satisfied with that answer, and went back to her coloring. But Emily stayed where she was, her mind lingering on the conversation. Mia's biological parents had been a mystery when she adopted her, and Emily had never felt the need to dig into the past. She was Mia's mother now, and that was all that mattered. Or so she thought. Across the city, Edward sat in his office, the lights dimmed and the hum of traffic audible through the large windows. The rejection from earlier still echoed in his mind, a sting to his ego that he couldn't quite shake. He wasn't used to hearing no, especially not from someone like Emily, a woman with no wealth, no connections, and no reason to turn down what he'd offered. On his desk was a framed photo, partially obscured by papers. Edward's gaze drifted to it, and his expression softened. He picked it up, staring at the image of a young woman holding a baby, her smile bright and carefree. The sight of it sent a pang through his chest, a mix of longing and regret. "You'd know what to do," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You always did." He set the photo down and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The past had a way of creeping up on him, no matter how hard he tried to keep it buried. And now, it seemed, the past was catching up faster than ever. The morning sunlight filtered through the apartment blinds, casting soft stripes across the living room. Emily sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee while Mia chattered away at the breakfast counter, her cereal crunching loudly between sentences. It was a simple, ordinary morning, one Emily cherished after the chaos of the night before. "Mommy, can we go to the park after school?" Mia asked, her big eyes hopeful. Emily smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. But only if you finish your homework first." "I will, I promise," Mia said, practically bouncing in her seat. Then, as if struck by a thought, she added, "Do you think we'll see the ice cream truck? I want the strawberry kind this time." "We'll see," Emily replied with a laugh. "But let's not make any promises to your sweet tooth just yet." The sound of her phone vibrating on the table pulled her attention. Emily glanced at the screen and froze. The name displayed was one she hadn't expected to see so soon, Edward. Her thumb hovered over the decline button, but something stopped her. Instead, she sighed and answered, her tone neutral. "What do you want, Edward?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, steady voice. "We need to talk." Emily's grip tightened on the phone. "I thought I made it clear last night. I have nothing to say to you." "This isn't about us," Edward said, his voice quieter now. "It's about Mia." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What about Mia?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I can't explain over the phone," Edward replied. "But I need to see you. Please." Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't trust Edward, not his intentions, not his money, not the way he seemed to bulldoze through life expecting everything to fall into place. But the mention of Mia made her pause. What could he possibly know about her daughter? "Fine," she said finally. "But this better be important." "It is," Edward said. "I'll send a car for you tonight." "No," Emily snapped. "If you want to talk, you'll meet me on my terms. There's a cafe on Willow Street. 6 o'clock. Don't be late." Before Edward could respond, Emily hung up. She set the phone down and took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside her. That evening, the cafe on Willow Street was bustling with the usual crowd, students hunched over laptops, couples sharing pastries, and regulars chatting with the baristas. Emily sat at a corner table, her arms crossed and her expression guarded as she waited. Edward walked in, his tailored suit making him stand out among the casual patrons. He spotted Emily immediately and approached, his posture confident but his face uncharacteristically serious. "You came," Emily said, her tone flat. "You didn't leave me much choice," Edward replied, sitting across from her. He placed a manila envelope on the table between them, its edges worn as if it had been handled too many times. "What's this?" Emily asked, eyeing the envelope suspiciously. Edward hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. "It's the reason I need to talk to you. But before I show you, I need you to promise me something." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You're not exactly in a position to ask for promises." "Just hear me out," Edward said, his tone softening. "Promise me you'll listen to everything I have to say before you make up your mind. That's all I'm asking." Emily stared at him for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "Fine. Go on." Edward opened the envelope and slid a photo across the table. Emily picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. The photo was old and slightly faded, but there was no mistaking the face of the woman holding a baby. It was Mia's biological mother. "What is this?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. "It's Mia's mother," Edward said quietly. "And the baby she's holding is Mia?" Emily's hands tightened around the photo as she stared at him, her mind racing. "How do you have this?" "Because," Edward said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. I took it? Emily's eyes snapped to his, her heart pounding. What are you talking about? Edward took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. Mia's mother and we were together years ago. It was brief and it ended badly, but I didn't know she was pregnant. She never told me. I found out after she was gone, after she gave Mia up for adoption. Emily felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. You're saying Mia is your daughter? Edward nodded, his expression solemn. Yes. Emily stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and confusion. Why are you telling me this now? Why not when you first found out? I didn't know how, Edward admitted. I didn't even know where Mia was until recently. It took years to track her down, and when I finally did, I didn't want to disrupt her life. But then I met you, and everything changed. Emily's mind reeled as she tried to process his words. She looked back at the photo in her hands, her eyes lingering on the baby's face. It was unmistakably Mia. I don't believe you, she said finally, her voice shaking. You're lying. I'm not, Edward said firmly. I can prove it. I've had a DNA test done. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a document, sliding it across the table. Emily hesitated before picking it up, her hands trembling as she read the results. The words stared back at her, undeniable and absolute. Edward was Mia's biological father. Emily's vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. She slammed the paper down on the table, her voice rising. How dare you? You think you can just waltz in here and claim her as if she's some prize? She's my daughter. I've raised her. I've loved her. And I'm grateful for that, Edward said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You've given her a life I couldn't. But she's my daughter too, Emily. I have a right to know her. Emily shook her head, her emotions spilling over. Oh, you don't get to do this. You don't get to upend our lives just because you suddenly decided to care. Edward leaned forward, his eyes pleading. I'm not trying to take her away from you. I just want to be part of her life. That's all I'm asking. Emily stared at him, her heart torn in two. She didn't know what to say, what to feel. The man she had pushed away, the man she didn't trust, was suddenly tied to her in a way she couldn't escape. The world outside the cafe felt distant, muffled, as if Emily and Edward were trapped in a vacuum of emotions and revelations. Emily's hands rested flat on the table, the DNA test and photo sitting between them, glaring back at her like accusations. What do you think this changes, Edward? She said finally, her voice low but trembling with suppressed anger. Do you think I'm just going to open the door to Mia's life and let you walk in because of this? She jabbed a finger at the DNA test. Edward leaned back, his expression a mixture of guilt and determination. I don't expect it to be easy. I don't expect you to trust me overnight. But I'm not walking away from this. From her. Emily shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You don't get it, do you? Mia doesn't even know you exist. She doesn't know her biological father is some millionaire with a god complex who thinks he can fix everything with money. I don't want to fix this with money, Edward said sharply, his voice cutting through her words. I want to fix it by being there for her. By being the father she deserves. You don't deserve her. Emily snapped, her voice rising. A few heads in the cafe turned, but she didn't care. You weren't there when she took her first steps. You weren't there when she cried because she thought the world was too big and scary. You weren't there when she needed someone to tell her it was all going to be okay. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life, Edward said, his voice breaking. But I can't change the past, Emily. All I can do is try to be part of her future. Emily stared at him, her breath coming in short, angry bursts. She wanted to throw the papers in his face, to storm out and slam the door on this entire conversation. But something held her back, a tiny voice in the back of her mind that whispered, what if he's telling the truth? What if he really cares? She hated that voice. I need time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Time to think about this. To figure out what's best for Mia. Edward nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his impatience. Take all the time you need. But please, don't shut me out completely. She's my daughter too. Emily didn't respond. She stood, gathering her bag and the documents before walking out of the cafe without looking back. That night, Emily sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out before her like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. Mia was asleep in her room, her soft snores drifting through the apartment. The quiet should have been comforting, but it felt oppressive, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. She picked it up and saw a text from Edward. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know this isn't easy, but I believe we can figure this out together." She didn't reply. Instead, she stared at the screen until the light faded, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The days that followed were a blur of routine and inner turmoil. Emily went to work, played with Mia, and tried to keep her mind off Edward and the bombshell he dropped. But it was impossible. Every time she looked at Mia, she saw the resemblance, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. How had she not noticed before? One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a cartoon, Mia looked up at her with a curious expression. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you think my daddy would like me?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. Emily's heart twisted painfully. "Why would you ask that, baby?" Mia shrugged, her little shoulders rising and falling. "I just wonder, sometimes, if he ever thinks about me." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Of course he would like you. He would love you. Anyone who meets you would love you." Mia smiled, satisfied with the answer, and turned back to the TV. But Emily couldn't focus. The conversation with Edward replayed in her mind, over and over, like a broken record. Maybe it wasn't just about what she wanted. Maybe it was about what Mia needed. A week later, Emily stood in front of Edward's office building, clutching Mia's small hand. The towering glass structure reflected the city's skyline, a monument to wealth and power that felt worlds away from their modest life. Emily took a deep breath, her nerves raw. "Mommy, where are we?" Mia asked, craning her neck to look up at the building. "We're meeting someone," Emily said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Someone who's important?" Mia tilted her head, curious but trusting. She tightened her grip on Emily's hand as they walked through the revolving doors and into the sleek, marble lobby. The receptionist greeted them with a professional smile. "You must be Ms. Clark. Mr. Bennett is expecting you." Emily nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and followed the receptionist to the elevator. The ride to the top floor was silent, the hum of the elevator amplifying her racing thoughts. When the doors opened, Edward was waiting, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Emily." "Mia," he said, his voice soft as he stepped forward. He knelt to Mia's level, his gaze filled with wonder. "Hi, Mia." "I'm Edward." Mia looked up at Emily, seeking reassurance, and Emily nodded. Slowly, Mia turned back to Edward. "Hi," she said shyly. Edward smiled, his eyes glistening. "It's so nice to meet you. I've heard so many wonderful things about you." "You have?" Mia asked, her curiosity piqued. "Absolutely," Edward said. "Your mommy tells me you're an amazing artist." "Is that true?" Mia's face lit up. "I like to draw. Do you want to see my pictures?" "I'd love to," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily watched the exchange, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. She wasn't ready to trust Edward completely, but seeing him with Mia, seeing the genuine affection in his eyes, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was room for him in their lives. Edward led them into his office, a sprawling space that felt more like a penthouse suite than a workplace. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and the furniture was sleek and modern, with subtle touches of warmth. A photo frame here, a vase of fresh flowers there. Emily couldn't help but notice the contrast between the cold, corporate world she expected and the softer, personal touches that hinted at a different side of Edward. Mia's eyes widened as she took it all in. "Wow, your office is so big." Edward chuckled, crouching down again to her level. "Do you like it?" Mia nodded enthusiastically. "It's like a castle." Emily folded her arms, watching the interaction with cautious curiosity. Edward glanced up at her as if seeking permission, and when she gave a small nod, he turned his attention back to Mia. "Would you like to draw something for me?" Edward asked, gesturing to the coffee table where a stack of papers and colored pencils sat, as if he'd planned for this moment. Mia's face lit up. "Yes, please?" She hurried over to the table, her small hands eagerly sorting through the pencils. Emily sat down on one of the chairs, her arms still crossed. Edward took a seat across from her, his expression serious now. "Thank you for bringing her," he said quietly. "I know this isn't easy for you." Emily's jaw tightened. "I'm not doing this for you, Edward. I'm doing it for her." "I understand," he said, his gaze steady. "And I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm serious about being part of her life." Emily hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him, but the walls she'd built over the years wouldn't come down so easily. "This isn't just about showing up once or twice and then disappearing again," she said, her voice firm. "If you're going to be in her life, you have to be consistent. She's been through enough already." "I know," Edward said, leaning forward. "And I swear to you, I'm not going anywhere. I've made mistakes, Emily. More than I care to admit. But this, Mia, she's my chance to make things right." Emily studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. To her surprise, she found none. His eyes were earnest, almost pleading. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. "Let's take it one step at a time," she said finally. "For now, you can see her occasionally, but I'll be there. Always." Edward nodded, his relief evident. "That's all I'm asking." Over the next few weeks, Edward slowly began integrating into Mia's life. At first, their meetings were brief and carefully supervised by Emily. They'd meet at parks, where Edward would push Mia on the swings or marvel at her chalk drawings on the pavement. At first, Mia had been shy, unsure of what to make of him. But Edward's genuine interest and patience gradually won her over. One sunny afternoon, they sat on a picnic blanket in the park. Mia was showing Edward her latest drawing, a colorful scene of a castle surrounded by flowers. Edward held it up, his expression one of genuine admiration. "This is amazing, Mia," he said. "You've got such a talent for drawing." Mia beamed. "Mommy says I should be an artist when I grow up." Edward glanced at Emily, who was sitting a few feet away, pretending to read a book. "She's right," he said. "You can be anything you want to be. Even a princess?" Mia asked, her eyes wide. Edward laughed. "Especially a princess." Emily looked up from her book, her lips curving into a small smile despite herself. She couldn't deny that Edward had a way with Mia, a natural ability to make her feel special and valued. But every time she felt herself softening, she reminded herself of the pain and uncertainty he'd brought into their lives. Trust wasn't something she could give easily. One evening, Edward invited them to his home, a sprawling estate that felt more like a museum than a house. Emily was reluctant, but Mia's excitement was contagious. "Mommy, can we go? Please? I want to see where Mr. Edward lives." "It's up to you," Edward said, his tone careful. "No pressure." Emily sighed, knowing she couldn't deny Mia this small joy. She said, "But don't expect me to be impressed." When they arrived, Mia's jaw practically hit the floor. The front yard was adorned with manicured gardens, a fountain, and a winding driveway that led to a grand entrance. Edward greeted them at the door, dressed in casual clothes that made him seem less intimidating. "Welcome," he said, stepping aside to let them in. Mia ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the cavernous halls. Emily followed more slowly, taking in the opulence with a critical eye. Edward noticed and gave her a small smile. "I know it's a lot," he said, "but it's just a house. What matters is who's inside it." Emily raised an eyebrow. "That's a convenient sentiment coming from someone who lives in a palace?" Edward chuckled softly. "Fair point. But I'd trade it all to have what you have with Mia." Emily's defenses faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Words are easy, Edward. Prove it with actions." "I intend to," he said, his gaze steady. Mia's laughter drew their attention to the living room, where she was spinning in circles, pretending to be a ballerina. Edward watched her with a look of pure joy, and Emily felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Was it hope? Fear? Maybe both. As the evening wore on, Mia fell asleep on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal Edward had given her. Emily covered her with a blanket and sat down across from Edward. "She's happy," Emily said quietly. "And that's all I want for her." "Me too," Edward said. He hesitated before adding, "I hope one day you'll let me be part of that happiness." Emily looked at him, her walls still firmly in place. "We'll see." The weeks turned into months, and slowly, Edward became more of a presence in Mia's life. It started with simple outings, trips to the park, visits to the zoo, or afternoons spent at Edward's estate where Mia would paint in his study while Edward sat nearby, answering emails or quietly watching her create. He had bought her a full set of artist supplies, a gesture that made Emily wary at first, but Mia's uncontainable excitement softened her initial resistance. Emily remained cautious, always present during their interactions. She studied Edward closely, looking for cracks in his newfound devotion, signs that he might revert to the man who thought money solved everything. But, to her surprise, Edward seemed genuine. He was patient with Mia, attentive to her needs, and made a noticeable effort to connect without overstepping. One afternoon, as Mia played in the garden, Emily and Edward sat on a nearby bench. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. "You're good with her," Emily said finally, breaking the quiet. Edward glanced at her, surprised. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." Emily shrugged, still keeping her guard up. "She's happy. That's all that matters." Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know I have a long way to go to earn your trust, Emily. But I'm not going anywhere. For Mia or for you. For me." Emily's voice was sharp, almost defensive. "Edward, let's not pretend this is anything more than what it is. You're here for Mia, and that's fine. But don't make this about us." Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know you don't trust me, and I understand why. But I care about both of you. And I'm not just saying that." Emily looked away, focusing on Mia as she twirled among the flowers, her laughter carrying on the breeze. She wanted to believe Edward, but the scars of her past, the betrayals, the disappointments, made it nearly impossible. "Actions speak louder than words," she said quietly. "If you really mean what you say, prove it. Not just to me, but to her." "I will," Edward said, his voice resolute. That evening, as Emily tucked Mia into bed, the little girl looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mommy," she murmured, "do you think Mr. Edward is like my daddy?" Emily froze, her heart pounding. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" Mia yawned, snuggling deeper under the covers. "He's always so nice to me. And he looks at me like he really cares. Like you do." Emily's throat tightened. She smoothed Mia's hair, her voice soft. "He does care about you. Very much. Do you think he loves me?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, her emotions swirling. I think he's learning how to love you in the best way he knows how." Mia smiled, her eyes fluttering closed. "I hope so. I think I love him too." Emily sat there for a long time after Mia fell asleep, her hand resting gently on her daughter's. The walls she'd built around her heart felt less secure than they once had, and the idea of letting Edward in, truly in, terrified her. But hearing Mia's words, seeing the joy Edward brought to her life, made it harder to hold on to her fears. A few days later, Edward invited them to an event at his foundation, a charity gala to raise money for children's art programs. Emily hesitated, but Mia's enthusiasm won her over. When they arrived, Emily felt immediately out of place. The venue was lavish, filled with people dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits. Edward greeted them at the entrance, his eyes lighting up as he saw Mia. "You look beautiful," he said to her, bending down to meet her eye level. Mia giggled, twirling in her simple blue dress. "Do you like it? Mommy helped me pick it out." Edward glanced at Emily, his gaze lingering. "You both look beautiful." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Let's just get this over with." Inside, Edward made a point of introducing them to the guests, proudly speaking about Mia and her love for art. Emily noticed the way he spoke about her daughter, with genuine pride and affection. It wasn't a performance, it was real. As the evening went on, Edward took the stage to make a speech. He spoke about the importance of fostering creativity in children, about how art could transform lives and give kids a voice. But then his tone shifted, becoming more personal. "I wasn't always the man you see today," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "I've made mistakes. I've let people down. But someone once told me that actions speak louder than words, and that's what I'm here to do, take action. Not just for the children this foundation supports, but for my own child. My daughter, Mia." The crowd murmured, surprised by the revelation. Emily froze, her heart racing as Edward continued. "She doesn't know it yet, but she's my greatest inspiration. She's shown me what it means to love unconditionally, to see the world through fresh eyes. And I'm grateful every day for the chance to know her, to be part of her life." He paused, his gaze searching the crowd until it landed on Emily and Mia. "And I'm grateful to her mother, Emily, for giving me that chance. For teaching me what it means to truly care." The room erupted in applause, but Emily couldn't move. Her emotions were a tangled mess: pride, fear, hope, and a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years: trust. After the gala, Edward found Emily standing alone on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. He approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. "That was quite a speech," Emily said without looking at him. "I meant every word," Edward said quietly. Emily turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You put us in the spotlight tonight. Do you know how risky that was?" "I do," Edward admitted. "But I couldn't let another moment go by without acknowledging how much you both mean to me." Emily studied him, her walls slowly crumbling. "You've changed," she said softly. "I don't know how or why, but you have." Edward took a step closer, his voice steady. "You changed me, Emily. You and Mia. You've shown me what really matters." For the first time, Emily didn't look away. She let his words settle, their weight sinking into the spaces she'd kept guarded for so long. "Maybe," she said after a long pause, "we can figure this out. Together." Edward's eyes softened, a small, hopeful smile playing on his lips. "I'd like that." In the days following the gala, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Edward's speech. His words replayed in her mind, each one chipping away at the walls she had built. She found herself wondering, could he truly be the man he claimed to be now? Could she trust him, not just with her daughter's heart, but with her own? Mia, of course, was oblivious to Emily's inner conflict. She was happier than Emily had ever seen her, eagerly talking about Edward every chance she got. "Mommy," Mia said one afternoon as they walked home from school, "do you think Mr. Edward will come to my art show next week?" Emily glanced down at her daughter, her heart tugging at the hope in Mia's voice. "I think he'd love to come, sweetheart." Mia grinned. "Do you think he'll like my paintings?" "I'm sure he'll think they're amazing," Emily said, squeezing Mia's hand. "Just like I do." Mia skipped the rest of the way home, humming to herself, while Emily's thoughts remained tangled. Edward's presence in their lives had grown stronger, and Mia had grown increasingly attached to him. The stakes were higher now. If Edward let them down, it wouldn't just hurt Emily, it would devastate Mia. The night of the art show arrived, and the small community center was packed with parents and children, all proudly admiring the displays. Emily stood near Mia's section, helping her pin the last of her paintings to the wall. "This one's my favorite," Mia said, pointing to a colorful portrait of a castle surrounded by flowers. Emily smiled. "It's beautiful, Mia. You did such a great job. Do you think Mr. Edward will like it?" Mia asked, looking toward the entrance. "He'll be here," Emily assured her, though her own nerves were starting to creep in. Just then, the door opened, and Edward stepped inside, his tall frame instantly noticeable in the crowded room. He was dressed more casually than usual, but he still exuded an air of confidence. When his eyes landed on Emily and Mia, he smiled and made his way over. "Mia," he said, crouching down to her level. "These are incredible. Did you paint all of these?" Mia nodded enthusiastically. "Do you really like them?" "I love them," Edward said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "You're so talented. I'm honored to see your work." Mia beamed, and Edward reached out to shake her tiny hand, as if sealing a professional deal. Do you think I could get one for my office? He asked. Really? Mia's eyes widened. You want one of my paintings? Of course, Edward said. I'd be lucky to have it. Mia turned to Emily, her face glowing with pride. Can I, Mommy? Can I give him one? Emily nodded, her own smile softening as she watched the exchange. Go ahead, sweetheart. Mia carefully took down the castle painting and handed it to Edward, who treated it as if it were a priceless masterpiece. Thank you, Mia, he said. I'll hang this in the best spot in my office. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to thin, Edward and Emily found themselves standing off to the side, watching Mia show her paintings to some of her friends. She's incredible, Edward said quietly. You've done such a great job raising her, Emily. Emily glanced at him, her defenses still partly intact. It's not easy, she admitted. But she makes it worth it. Edward's gaze softened. I want to be part of this, Emily. Not just for the big moments like tonight, but for all the little ones too. Homework, bedtime stories, everything. Emily hesitated, her heart caught between hope and fear. I don't know if I can trust you with that, Edward. You've made promises before. I know, Edward said, his voice steady. But I've changed. You've seen it. And I'm willing to keep proving myself, for as long as it takes. Emily searched his face, looking for any hint of insincerity, but found none. She took a deep breath, the weight of her doubts pressing against her. Mia loves you, she said finally, and that means something to me. But if you ever hurt her, if you ever let her down, I won't forgive you. I won't, Edward said, his tone resolute. You have my word. Emily nodded, the smallest flicker of trust beginning to take root. The months that followed were a delicate balancing act. Edward gradually became a bigger part of their lives, not just as an occasional visitor but as a steady presence. He showed up for school events, helped Mia with her art projects, and even cooked dinner once, though the results were questionable at best. Emily watched him closely, waiting for the moment he might falter, but to her surprise, he didn't. He was consistent, patient, and kind, not just with Mia but with her as well. Slowly, her walls began to come down. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Mia fell asleep with her head resting on Edward's lap. Emily glanced at him, her heart swelling at the sight. You're good with her, she said softly. Edward looked up, his expression warm. She makes it easy. Emily smiled, a real, genuine smile that she hadn't allowed herself to show in a long time. Thank you, she said. For being here. For her. And for you, Edward said, his voice gentle. I'll always be here, Emily. For both of you. For the first time, Emily believed him. Spring had come, bringing longer days and blossoming flowers. It was Mia's favorite time of year, and her joy was contagious. Edward had planned a picnic for them at the park, a simple but heartfelt gesture that showed how much he was learning about their lives. Emily stood under a large oak tree, watching as Mia ran ahead, her laughter filling the air. Edward followed close behind, holding a kite they had brought. He looked almost childlike as he tried to keep up with Mia's energy. Higher, Mr. Edward. Higher. Mia shouted, her arms outstretched as she watched the kite soar into the sky. Edward laughed, the sound rich and unrestrained. I'm trying, Mia. You've got to give me some credit. I don't do this every day. Emily couldn't help but smile at the sight. 4 months, she had been bracing for the moment when Edward would disappoint them, when his promises would falter. But that moment never came. If anything, he seemed more committed than ever. When Mia tired herself out and plopped down on the picnic blanket, Edward joined Emily under the tree. His shirt was untucked, his hair slightly disheveled, and he looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him. She's incredible, he said, his voice soft as he watched Mia play with a dandelion. Every day, she amazes me. She has that effect on people, Emily replied, her tone light. Edward turned to look at her, his expression serious now. And you? You amaze me too. Emily stiffened slightly, her guard instinctively rising. Edward, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I know I've made mistakes. And I know I have a lot to prove. But being with you and Mia, it's changed me, Emily. It's made me see what I've been missing all these years. Edward, you don't have to. I love you, he said, the words coming out as if they'd been bottled up for too long. I love both of you. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had spent so long protecting herself, shielding her heart from anyone who might break it. But as she looked into Edward's eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity, vulnerability, and a kind of love that scared her because of how real it felt. Edward, she began, her voice trembling, this isn't just about me. Mia's happiness is what matters most. I know, Edward said, his gaze unwavering. And I'll never do anything to jeopardize that. I want to be the man both of you deserve. Emily looked away, her emotions swirling. She had spent so long convincing herself that Edward couldn't change, that he didn't belong in their lives. But now, she wasn't so sure. Let's take it slow, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. For Mia's sake. One step at a time. Edward smiled, a look of pure relief washing over him. That's all I'm asking. The weeks that followed were filled with small but meaningful moments. Edward didn't just show up. He became a part of their lives in ways Emily hadn't expected. He helped with school drop-offs, attended parent-teacher conferences, and even learned how to braid Mia's hair, though his first few attempts were disastrous. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mia looked up from her plate with a thoughtful expression. Mommy, can Mr. Edward stay with us forever? She asked, her tone innocent but hopeful. Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. What do you mean, sweetheart? Mia shrugged. I just like it when he's here. It feels like a family. The room fell silent, the weight of Mia's words hanging in the air. Edward glanced at Emily, his eyes filled with unspoken emotion. Mia, Emily said gently, Mr. Edward cares about us very much. And he'll always be here for you. Right, Edward? Always, Edward said, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. Mia beamed, satisfied with that answer, and returned to her dinner. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter's words had struck a chord deep within her. Months later, on a crisp summer evening, Edward invited Emily and Mia to his estate for a special dinner. The garden was lit with twinkling lights, and the air was filled with the soft hum of music. Mia ran ahead, marveling at the fairy tale setting, while Emily lingered by the entrance, her nerves tingling. What's all this about? She asked as Edward approached, his hands in his pockets. It's a celebration, he said with a smile. Of us. Edward. Just trust me, he said, offering her his arm. Reluctantly, she took it. They sat down to a meal that was as exquisite as it was intimate. Edward had thought of everything, from Mia's favorite desserts to Emily's love of fresh flowers. But it wasn't until dessert that he truly surprised her. As Mia chased fireflies around the garden, Edward reached across the table and took Emily's hand. Emily, he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it would make me happy. But I was wrong. You and Mia, you're what makes me happy. You're my family. Edward, He stood, pulling a small box from his pocket. Emily's heart raced as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. Will you marry me? He asked, his voice filled with hope. Emily stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind. She thought of everything they'd been through, every doubt and fear she'd carried. But she also thought of the love she saw in his eyes, the way Mia had flourished with him in her life, and the way he had proven himself time and time again. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, I'll marry you. Edward's face lit up, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. Mia ran over, clapping her hands and shouting with joy. In that moment, under the twinkling lights of the garden, Emily realized something she hadn't dared to believe before. Love, real love, was worth the risk.